Here is a bet nobody tells you about in school. The people who built the American government did not think politicians would be good. They built the whole machine assuming politicians would be selfish, grabby, and hungry for power. And they bet the entire country on that selfishness canceling itself out. 2026 is the year that bet got put on the table again, in open court, in real time. And the results are not what either side expected.
Stick with us because by the end of this you will understand something most people watching the news this year do not. You will understand why the same court in the same year can hand the presidency enormous new power in one case, and then turn around and refuse it in another. It looks random. It is not random. It is a theory buckling under weight, one joint at a time. Chapter 1: The Machine Nobody Asked to Trust.
Let me introduce the man whose fingerprints are on almost every argument happening in Washington this year, whether anyone says his name or not. James Madison, 1787. Philadelphia, in the summer, before air conditioning, in wool coats, arguing for months about how to keep one person or one faction from swallowing the whole government. Madison's answer is famous, but almost nobody has sat with what it actually means. He wrote that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. Read that slowly. He is not saying good people will restrain bad people. He is saying every single person in government will be selfish, will want more power, will want more turf. And the trick is to design the system so that everybody's greed points at everybody else's greed, like a room full of loaded springs pushing against each other, holding the room up through tension rather than trust.
That is a strange thing to build a country on if you think about it. Most constitutions, most religions, most schools of ethics ask people to be virtuous. Madison basically said, forget virtue, assume everyone in this room is a little bit of a snake, and build the cage out of snakes biting each other's tails.
Exactly. And here is the everyday version of it, something you have probably lived through without naming it. Think about a company org chart. On paper, there is a clean line of authority. The manager approves the budget. The director signs off on hiring. The vice president reviews anything over a certain dollar amount. But if you have ever worked inside a real company, you know the org chart is a fiction half the time. The person who actually has to sign off on anything is whoever controls the budget spreadsheet, or whoever the founder still trusts from the early days, or whoever nobody wants to annoy because they are close to someone powerful. The rules on paper are Madison's Constitution. The unwritten reality of who actually has to say yes is the part almost nobody studies, and it turns out to be the part that decides whether the whole company runs well or badly.
Which is exactly where two modern political scientists walk into this story and complicate everything Madison assumed. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt spent years studying how democracies actually die, not in history textbooks, but in the 20th and 21st centuries, and their answer is uncomfortable for anyone who loves the Madison story. They argue that written rules only work if the people in power choose to enforce unwritten norms nobody put in the Constitution at all. Things like, you do not use every legal tool available just because it is legal. You do not pack the court just because you technically can. You lose an election and you leave. Madison built beautiful hardware. Levitsky and Ziblatt are asking whether the software, the culture, the shared agreement to not push every lever all the way, is the thing actually keeping the machine from tearing itself apart. Chapter 2: When the Hardware Failed in Public.
To see this tension for real, and not just in theory, we have to go back almost exactly 100 years, to a country that did something nobody had really done before. Germany, after the First World War, wrote one of the most admired constitutions in Europe. The Weimar Constitution. On paper it had elections, free press, a parliament, a president, checks in almost every direction Madison would have recognized. It also had one clause, Article 48, that let the president suspend civil rights and rule by emergency decree during a crisis. It was meant for genuine emergencies, a flood, a coup attempt, chaos in the streets. But here is the part that should make anyone nervous. Article 48 got used constantly, long before things got truly dangerous, because it was simply easier than building coalitions in Parliament. By the early 1930s, emergency decree had become the normal way of governing, not the exception. And when Adolf Hitler became chancellor in 1933, the machinery for ruling without parliament was already warmed up and waiting for him. He did not have to invent the tool. He just had to pick it up.
This is the exact nightmare Levitsky and Ziblatt point to. The written rule, emergency powers for genuine crises, was fine on paper. What failed was the unwritten norm, the shared understanding among German politicians that you save the emergency clause for actual emergencies. Once that norm eroded, the parchment barrier, as Madison himself once called written constitutional limits, turned out to be exactly that. Parchment. Thin and easy to walk through once nobody on the other side is willing to stop you.
Now here is where it gets interesting, because Madison's own country had a moment that could have gone the same way, and did not. 1973. October. A Saturday night. President Richard Nixon wants the special prosecutor investigating the Watergate break-in, a man named Archibald Cox, fired. Nixon orders his attorney general to do it. The attorney general refuses and resigns on the spot. Nixon orders the deputy attorney general to do it. He also refuses and also resigns. Nixon finally finds a third official willing to carry out the order, and Cox is fired that night. On paper, the president technically had the authority to do this. Legally, he won that night. But politically, it detonated. Congress moved toward impeachment within days. Public opinion turned hard against Nixon almost overnight. And 10 months later, facing near-certain impeachment and conviction, Nixon resigned, the only American president in history to do so.
Notice what actually stopped him. It was not a court order that physically prevented the firing happened. It was two officials who refused to be complicit and quit rather than comply, and a Congress that was willing, in that era, to actually use its power. That is the unwritten norm doing the work the written rule could not do alone. Same country, same constitution, same emergency-flavored crisis of a president reaching for more power than anyone expected him to use. One time the guardrail held. In Weimar it did not. The difference was never the paper. It was whether enough people with power were willing to spend their own political capital defending the system, instead of the man in charge of it. Chapter 3, 2026 Live on the Docket.
Which brings us to right now this year, and a term of the Supreme Court that gave Madison's theory its most public stress test in a generation. In June of this year, the court ruled that Congress cannot require the president to have cause before removing officials who lead independent agencies. That may sound dry, but it overturned a precedent from 1935, a case that had stood for 9 decades protecting the idea that certain regulatory officials should be insulated from being fired purely for political reasons. 90 years of settled law, gone in one term. The logic behind the ruling is genuinely Madisonian, at least on its face. If the president is accountable to voters for how the executive branch behaves, the argument goes, the president needs the power to remove the people running it. Otherwise, you get unelected officials answering to nobody. That is a real and serious argument, not a fringe one.
Here is the twist, though, and it is the twist that should stop you in your tracks. The very same term, the very same court in a companion case, declined to extend that same logic to a governor of the Federal Reserve. Same theory, same president, same legal question of whether the executive can remove an official without cause. Everywhere else, the theory of a unified executive, one person ultimately in charge of the entire executive branch, won almost completely. The one place it did not win was the one institution with arguably the single biggest impact on the price of everything you buy, the value of your savings, and the interest rate on your mortgage.
And I want to be careful here, because the easy thing to do is turn this into a simple story, good court or bad court, hero or villain. That is not what is actually happening, and it is more interesting than that. What we are watching is not a single, consistent doctrine being applied evenly. It is Madison's theory of counteracting ambitions meeting a world he did not fully anticipate, one where the Supreme Court itself has become one of the ambitious players in the room, not just a referee standing outside the game. The court expanded presidential power almost everywhere, and in doing so also expanded its own power, because it is the court deciding, case by case, exactly where the line sits. Congress, meanwhile, the branch Madison actually expected to be the most jealous, the most aggressive about guarding its own turf, has largely stepped back this year rather than asserting its own institutional prerogative. One legal scholar summarized the deeper problem well. The American system was never designed to have courts stand as the only check on the executive branch. It was designed for three branches leaning against each other. This year, it has often looked more like two.
And this is precisely the blind spot Levitsky and Ziblatt would point to. Madison assumed ambition would automatically produce resistance, that a Congress full of people jealous of their own institutional power would fight to keep it, the way the Deputy Attorney General fought back in 1973. But ambition for personal advancement and ambition for institutional power are not always the same thing. A member of Congress today can be enormously ambitious for re-election, for a cable news hit, for staying in good standing with their own party's base, while being almost completely indifferent to whether Congress itself keeps its constitutional muscle. The ambition Madison counted on to defend the institution has, in a lot of cases, been redirected somewhere else entirely.
So here is the honest, uncomfortable summary of 2026 without picking a side. The written rules moved sharply in one direction. The one visible exception involved the most economically sensitive institution in the country, and the branch that was supposed to defend its own turf mostly did not. That is not a verdict on any single person in office. That is Madison's machine showing you, in real time, which of its springs are still under tension and which ones have gone slack. Chapter 4: The Uncomfortable Question.
So let's ask the question political scientists are increasingly willing to say out loud, even if it makes people uncomfortable at dinner parties. Was a system built in 1787, for 13 small agricultural states with no political parties, no mass media, and no professional bureaucracy, ever designed for a world with 24-hour cable news, algorithmically sorted social media, and a federal government spending trillions of dollars a year? Madison did not plan for political parties at all. He actually hoped the Constitution would prevent them, thought factions would be too fragmented and local to organize nationally. Within a decade of ratification, 2 national parties existed anyway, and every single check Madison designed, the veto, the confirmation process, impeachment, has to pass through the filter of party loyalty before it can even be considered. Ambition counteracting ambition works differently when half of Congress shares a party with the president and has a direct incentive not to counteract anything.
Yet here is the other side of that same coin, the side that keeps this from being a simple story of decline. The system that Madison built has now survived a civil war, a Great Depression, 2 world wars, a president resigning under threat of impeachment, and roughly 240 years without a single unconstitutional transfer of power. That is not nothing. Weimar lasted 14 years. Whatever is happening in 2026, it is happening inside a structure with a genuinely remarkable track record of eventually correcting itself, even when it bends alarmingly in the moment.
Which is really the honest place to leave this. Not with a verdict, but with the actual tension both theories share. Madison says the structure survives because ambition is engineered to fight ambition automatically, no virtue required. Levitsky and Ziblatt say the structure survives only as long as enough people, enough Archibald Coxes, enough attorneys general willing to resign rather than comply, choose to defend norms that were never written down at all. 2026 did not answer which theory is correct. It showed you both of them operating at the exact same moment, in the exact same term of the same court, pulling in different directions. That is the uncomfortable part. And it is also, honestly, the interesting part.
This is not a story about one politician, one party, or one court term. It is a story about whether a 240-year-old bet on human selfishness still pays out the way it was designed to. Watch how the next few years unfold, and you will be watching the test results come in live.
And if ambition counteracting ambition is the engine, the next question is obvious. What happens when the state itself, the actual capacity to govern, to collect taxes, deliver services, hold a monopoly on force, starts to weaken underneath the politics? That is where Francis Fukuyama comes in, and that is where we are headed next.